Welcome everyone to the October meeting of the Project Advisory Group for the Clark County Housing Options Study and Action Plan. This is the 8th meeting of this group. Thank you all so much for your participation throughout and sticking with us. We really appreciate it. We're in the home stretch. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So over the summer, June, July, and August, the group met 3 times to review a list of potential housing strategies to address the identified needs and meet the objectives that the group established prior to that. And during those 3 meetings, we took copious notes at the comments that you all made during our breakout room discussions, and we put together what we think are the priority strategies based on those discussions. So today, after our announcements, Elizabeth Decker from Jet Planning and I are going to present those priority strategies. And then we have about an hour for discussion. And today we're going to have that discussion in the large group format. I'll repeat this again shortly, but please do be ready to take notes because we are going to move through the presentation, not pausing at each strategy for discussion, but move through the full presentation and then really open it up to the group to identify if there are strategies in particular that you want to talk about, because we have about an hour for discussion. Otherwise, and if we went through every one, we definitely wouldn't have time to touch on them all. So following that discussion, we will have time for public comment and then move into next steps. Yes. And I'm going to hand it over to Jackie for announcements.
Hello, everybody. It's good to see everybody. We just have one one announcement today, in addition to the information that we've been providing you in preparation for today's meeting. But I did want to introduce a new member that's going to be joining us for the last few meetings here to represent communities of color. Ms. Carol Collier needed to step down, so we were fortunate enough to have Yolanda Frazier from the NAACP take her position and be our communities of color advocate. So I just want to welcome Yolanda to the meeting, and Jenna and I are going to help her get caught up, and we've been working with her. So we're excited to have her on the call today.
Welcome, Yolanda. Thanks for joining us. And I'm going to hand it over now to Commissioner Barca, who has an announcement to make.
Thank you, Steve. I just wanted to let everybody know that I have signed papers to become an employee of Wolf Industry, the makers of the tiny homes, where we went for a tour recently. I'm just getting that out there so it's public and knowledge. I'm not representing them in this meeting, and I am doing work just to help them become more efficient. I am not involved in sales of any kind, but I did want to make sure that everybody was aware that I am now employed by Wolf Industries. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron, for being transparent with the group. We certainly appreciate that. Okay. So moving along to our presentation, again, just recapping, from June through August, we've completed the 3 meetings to review our large list of potential strategies. And then in September, we presented the results of those discussions or tried to summarize those discussions for County Council, Planning Commission, and the DEAB. And now here we are in October. The PAG has 2 more meetings. Today we'll be going through these priority strategies. And following this meeting, we will be sharing those again with Planning Commission, Council, and the broader public, and they'll go forth as draft recommendations from the PAG. So so just be aware that we'll make some revisions based on your discussion today, and then those will go out as draft recommendations. I'll mention this again at the end of the meeting, but our 9th and final PAG meeting is going to be on January 25th, because we're going to take some time to do some community engagement and reach out to Planning Commission and County Council. I'll be sure to send a calendar invite after this meeting. And then once we wrap up after your last meeting, we will begin preparing the final action plan, doing some more community engagement, and starting the adoption process. Excuse me. So the one thing that you probably noticed if you had a chance to review the document we put together is that we changed our format a little bit. We identified tiers of priority based on what we heard from you. And you know, the short version is that the tier 1 strategies had 2 elements in common for the most part, that we think they're going to be effective in a short period of time, something we can implement in a short period of time, and also things that have low costs and administrative effort. We also added things that we consider low-hanging fruit, which are relatively simple to implement, but maybe don't have quite the same impact. But we wanted to include things that we can implement in a short time frame. Tier 2 strategies are things that take a little bit longer to implement, things that we need to do studies on to implement correctly to a large degree, but still have a pretty good impact based on our conversations. And then there's just a few strategies in tier 3 that we thought were worth keeping on the list, but are not a high priority. I'll also mention that we, excuse me, kept the numbering system from the previous drafts that you saw with that A through G, I believe, numbering system, because we wanted you to be able to go backwards and track the discussion or the information we presented on all the strategies previously. But after this meeting, we'll likely scrap that for a numbering system that's easier for the public to digest. Within these 3 tiers, we also did try to group them by strategy type. So you'll be hearing a lot from Elizabeth today on strategies related to code changes, updates to the development code that either expand housing options and enhance the feasibility of enhance the feasibility of existing options. Strategies related to affordable housing, and sometimes these overlap, so I don't want them to seem mutually exclusive, but we were trying to find the primary focus. Programs and partnerships, a lot of these projects, the county has maybe not a primary role, but a role to support other organizations or to distribute funds to other organizations to carry out certain activities. And then advocacy, where we're looking for legislative changes at the state level, and there are tools that just aren't currently available for the county to use. Jackie, could you remind me what the DEAB, what that stands for?
Sure, it's the Development Engineering Advisory Board, and that's with the county.
Thank you. Okay, just to remember, and I don't want this to greatly impact how we go about our conversation today, but when we started this project, we all agreed to use a consensus based decision-making process. And, you know, from my perspective, what that means is that, you know, we can move forward with these strategies if no one voices an objection. If someone voices an objection, we'll discuss that strategy and see if we can make changes to make it acceptable to everyone. But in general, just know that if you are silent on a strategy, that kind of means that you approve of it moving forward into the draft recommendations. So, like I said, as we go through these strategies, please take notes and be ready to you know, note the ones that you want to talk about when the time comes. And so our key questions for today are, number one, are there any details within the strategies that you would recommend revising? And if so, how? Elizabeth noted we need some feedback from this group on a few specific strategies, which are listed there. But we'll after we go through the full presentation, we'll start with those strategies, and then we'll move on to a broader, open it up to the group to see if there are other strategies that people would like to discuss. Second question, would you recommend reprioritizing any strategies into a different tier? So if we have something in the second tier that you think really can be implemented in the short term and should be moved up, we can talk about that. Are there strategies that have been removed that should be added back in? We did, based on our discussions with you, we did take some strategies off the table. Clearly, we can't in this one fell swoop implement every strategy that we've talked about. So we're trying to be efficient. And then finally, are there any strategies that should be added that we haven't even talked about yet? We want to keep that door open as well. So are there any questions from PAG members before we get started on the presentation? All right.
Steve, would there be any value in clarifying the criteria for the tiers, or do you think that's covered well enough?
Well, I can go through it again. It's certainly covered in detail in the documents that we sent out to everyone. Tier 1, I think the key factor that we're looking at, in addition to, did the PAG and did we as a consultant team and staff think the strategy is important and effective, but the timeline of these is important as well, because our charge from the county was to have some implementable or implementation ready recommendations at the end of this project. The second tier is really strategies that we think are important, but have a little bit longer timeline. They're going to require some follow-up steps in terms of, for instance, I think there's some related to density bonuses. Studies are needed to figure out how to calibrate a density bonus to make sure it's going to be effective. That's just one example, but that's the primary difference between the two in my mind is timeline for implementation. Hope that answers your question. Okay. And see if I mentioned the numbering system. And so with that, I think, Elizabeth, I'm going to hand it over to you to start talking about some of the strategies related to code changes.
Great. Thank you, Steve. And thanks everyone for being here, joining us to talk about more details. I think just as a segue from that earlier question, what we really tried to focus on with the code changes, with the strategies in this tier 1, was really thinking about what is a package of code updates that we can prepare as part of this project to move forward within the next year. And so those are code updates where we felt like we had a direction, we had enough information. There are some code updates in the second tier where we needed more study, more analysis. And so those are just going to take longer and not be able to move forward. But it's also interesting, we spent some time internally talking about, do we have the right priorities? Is there enough in this bundle? Is there too much in this bundle? To think about shaping this into a code update package. So just keep that in mind also. We've had a lot of really good feedback and wide interests. So we've got a lot of code. I'll try to go through it fairly quickly, but we'll just touch on the basics. First one was making better use of the land we have by reducing minimum lot sizes for housing types that are already permitted in the low and the medium density zones. So that's the single family detached, the townhouses, and the duplexes. And we proposed this strategy based on the existing base zones rather than a strategy that we talked about strategies for rezoning land. So rather than upzoning to a more dense zone, we're proposing to make development denser in the zones that already exist. Next. Another thing that we heard really clearly was this desire to have a pathway to develop smaller single-family detached dwellings that could be produced at lower price points, both because the land costs and the dwelling costs, construction costs, were less because of the higher density and smaller lot sizes. And so we considered multiple pathways to get there, including revisions to the cottage housing code. We have heard some comments about increasing the dwelling size, as well as some of the other lot the site layout requirements. But rather than change the cottage housing or the PUD path at this point, what we're proposing is a third option that we're tentatively calling the compact subdivision option. And this pulls on some of the principles of the county's earlier infill ordinance. So the idea is that it would apply selectively to some smaller parcels or parcels in particular locations. We're looking for some feedback from you about that. But it really shrinks the lot size and increases the density, and with proportional scaling, those dwellings also need to come down to match the proportion of the smaller size lots, and then treat the perimeter with some concern for abutting residential uses. So we felt like this was the way to move this option for smaller single family detached dwellings forward in the most coherent manner that was clear to its purpose, rather than trying to really change some of the existing options to do different things. So next. So there's some
Elizabeth, I need to have an understanding. How do you want feedback to come? Do you want to go through this all and then come back to it?
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Yes, the idea is that we are going to try to give you a high-level overview right now, and then we're going to come back to all of this as part of the discussion. So I realize there's a lot, but appreciate if you can all take notes about strategies you want to come back to, and we can also come back to some of these individual slides as well.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so certainly some discussion here as we think about, does this path make the most sense, or should we take another look at the POD or the cottage modifications, how to define applicability, and whether middle housing is included here. Go ahead. All right, another piece in the high density zones, we are proposing to boost the minimum density. We're not proposing any changes to maximum density right now, but just making that land more efficient by increasing minimums. Go ahead. And then this is really one of the big strategies that we're proposing about expanding middle housing types, something we've talked a lot about. And so that's going to target the low and the medium residential zones by introducing some new triplex and quadplex uses, and then permitting duplexes and townhouses more broadly throughout all the low density as well as the medium density zones. Go ahead. So there's some questions here that we'd love to get input on about. We have some tentative lot sizes we're looking at that were included in the handout. If you have feedback on that, great. Otherwise, we'll develop the details as we go along. Your feedback on design standards we had mentioned, and are there other dimensional site design or building issues that you'd like to see addressed as these middle housing types get added to the code? Next slide, please. I believe I promised you some examples of what some non-discretionary design standards could look like for these middle housing types. And the kinds of standards we're seeing in other jurisdictions have to do with things like entryway orientation to create a more pedestrian friendly connection between the dwelling and the street, greater visibility, seasonally appropriate, can the house pass the trick or treat test of, a determined child wanting candy, can they find the front door? Other one has to do with the proportion of building facade to garage and driveway placement. Another one, you could look at minimum window coverage and also look at variety of architectural features that could be required and whether they have to be differentiated across units. So those are some of the types of things we mean when we talk about design standards for middle housing, and we have the option to add those types of standards in. Next. Then the next issue that we looked at was we prioritized permitting affordable, regulated, affordable housing projects, permitting those residential uses outright in commercial zones without a requirement for ground floor commercial. And we talked about this strategy, broadly permitting residential and commercial, and we chose in tier 1 to prioritize just those regulated affordable housing uses. So for further discussion does that distinction make sense to you and match the group's priorities? Or are there any additional market rate residential uses that could be permitted in the commercial zones as part of this update? If so, what types of projects would you like to see prioritized, or simply all residential projects do you think could be included? Go ahead. Next piece, we get into parking requirements. So a key part of making those new middle housing types work is parking requirements of 1 space per unit for duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes. So always interesting feedback here. Does that sound right? Or should these minimums have any variation depending on sites? Or is it just specific to the dwelling type? Go ahead. We're also looking at revising the minimum parking for narrow lots. That's primarily townhouses, but could also be some single family detached. So changing that standard to be 2 off-street spaces, which is equal to the requirement for single family detached right now. Go ahead. And then parking requirements for multifamily can certainly be one of the big drivers of site design that we've talked about. So as a Tier 1 strategy, we're proposing making some changes to the requirements for sites that are accessed by transit. That includes both market rate and regulated affordable housing, and that's required to comply with some recent state revisions. So the strategy is to prioritize the state mandates right now, and then you'll see in Tier 2, we have a more comprehensive multifamily parking update proposed. But we thought as Tier 1, this was sort of the low-hanging fruit to make sure that we captured this. But certainly looking for your input here. Should we look at further reductions targeted for affordable housing? Right under this, it would be the same for regulated affordable and market rate. And or, would you like to see additional parking reductions in this Tier 1 strategy? Go ahead. The Highway 99 plan, we're proposing some pretty limited revisions that we heard through this group about specific to regulated affordable housing and middle housing. Go ahead. And then, as I mentioned, we're proposing that compact subdivision option for more of the detached single family on small lot development. And we wanted to maintain the fidelity of the cottage housing concept to really stay focused on this idea of a cluster of small scale units, but still improve the feasibility of how these standards are working. So a couple of things, got a list of some things that we think that could help. And chief among them is increasing the density and considering a variety of both attached and detached units, as long as it's just clustered around that common green area. Go ahead. Minor revision here to the open space requirements for larger multifamily projects. The idea here being that open space will continue to be required across developments, but we're going to give a little break on how much of that open space is required for some of the highest density projects. There'll still be quality open space, but the open space won't continue to increase proportionate to the density. Go ahead. Similar to the cottage housing, we recognize that the county's already done a lot of work on the urban ADU provisions. So we just want to build on those. A few refinements that we see opportunities for. Probably the key is whether there's an opportunity to remove the parking requirements entirely. They've sort of been removed, decreased bit by bit. Now there's just a few outstanding circumstances where off-street parking is required. So considering whether there could be, one more incremental step towards removing parking at this time. And then the other key issue that we'd like to discuss is whether 2 ADUs could be allowed on a property. Right now it's limited to 1, but that could be increased to 2. That would be in keeping with the expansion to triplexes and quadplexes, right? If you could do that many units, why not do it as a dwelling and 2 ADUs? So that's a new opportunity that we would look for some feedback on. Go ahead. And then as a Tier 1 strategy, we've heard about interest in using RVs and tiny homes as dwellings. And right now, the Tier 1 option is to look at expanding both the permission to use those within RV parks and expanding which commercial zones are permitted for RV parks so that there's more opportunities to site these in parks. As a tier 2 strategy, we're proposing some additional study of how individual RVs or tiny homes could be used on an individual residential lot, a little bit more almost like an ADU concept. But we're proposing that as a tier 2, would need some further review and development, but expanding where RV parks are permitted is certainly something we could accomplish in tier 1. Go ahead. And Steve is where I hand it over to you, but
Yeah,
it's a good segue.
This is where I jump in.
Yeah.
Okay, so continuing with our tier 1 strategies, this strategy looks to reduce development review times and permitting requirements. We would do that for low income housing projects by looking, well, one of the ways we want to do that is by looking at concurrent review of preliminary land use and final engineering applications, and also allowing the submittal of building permit applications at any time after preliminary review approval. You can see we're looking to reduce development review times for low income housing projects primarily here, using a type 1 site plan review concurrent with final engineering review for triplex and quadplexes with road or sidewalk improvements, and then clarifying the standards and procedures for uses subject to review and approval. So really just reducing development review times there. Adopting a visibility program, which really looks at either voluntary incentives or code requirements to look at features like a no-step barrier-free entrance, accessible bathroom and small living area, to the main entrance, and wider doors throughout the living area. The next two we have here are reviewing the code to make sure there are no barriers to the conversion of existing motels and hotels into permanent affordable housing. I think we heard support from the group for this idea. There would just need to be a review of the code. Second one is reviewing the definitions of household, housekeeping unit, and family to remove the numbers of unrelated persons that may define a household. I think this is also required by the state, so something that needs to be done in any case. Implementing bonus density for affordable housing on religious organizations' land. Again, this is something that's required, so it would just be aligning with the state law. The next strategy, create an affordable housing point of contact to provide education, resources, and help developers understand the various affordable housing incentives. I think we heard a lot of support for this from all of our groups during our breakout room discussions over the past few months. And a couple more of the low-hanging fruit, continuing council advocacy to expand the multifamily tax exemption to counties. I'll note that we discussed if that comes into play at some point, that the county should consider implementing an income target in the 50% to 80% AMI range. Is something that we talked about. I don't think that's required by the state law, but something that you all thought that the county should consider. And then supporting legislative changes that would fix issues with the state's condominium defect liability law. We talked about that a bunch. Okay, deep breath. And then I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth again to start us off on the tier 2 strategies.
Great, thanks, Steve. Yes, so these are generally areas where we felt like there was further work that needed to be done, greater effort by staff and or consultants to help guide the county. But first one is look at potentials for upzoning, of particularly looking for more high density residential zoning. That could either be through rezoning existing land or thinking about appropriate zones and designations to apply as land is brought into the urban growth area. So we can look at that for taking existing residential and upzoning it, but also we've talked about rezoning some commercial properties for high density residential use instead. Go ahead. Another longer term strategy, right now the county has the policies and about that no one housing type can exceed 75% of the housing stock or the housing capacity. So the 75 and the 25% has to be reserved for a variety of alternatives. That has typically meant that 75% of housing opportunities are single family detached. And so there's some upcoming work with the next comprehensive plan update to look at housing affordability metrics and needs. And so we're proposing that that be the time to review this split and see if that still meets the housing affordability needs of the county, and if, you know, and looking at any modifications to that as needed. Go ahead. In the middle housing world, you saw the types that we're proposing as tier 1. The one type that is sometimes discussed is courtyard apartments. Those are typically 1 to 2 stories, 5 to 12 units. And those could be permitted in the medium density zones, but we saw those as more a tier 2 strategy. There's been less discussion about this both internally as well as across the state. And so we just felt like there could be some additional work to develop design standards and think about where this would be most appropriate before moving it forward. Go ahead. And I think this was what we termed the eat your broccoli approach. And so what we proposed was to expand the buffet by adding all the middle housing options. So, you know, you have your choice of a whole rainbow's worth of vegetables and cookies on the table. And you can choose whatever you want by adding duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and expanding townhouses. But as a longer term strategy, we're proposing to study the ongoing housing production trends and see if the way that the limited, medium, and high density residentially zoned land is really being used for a mix of housing types. And if there's concern about how that land is being used, then looking at whether certain housing types should be taken off the menu in order to encourage, you know, greater uptake of some of a greater variety of housing types. So we're not proposing to limit any housing types at this time. The tier 2 strategy does not, you know, explicitly promote limiting them at this time. It just says that we would continue to study those trends and continue taking measures if warranted, and consider taking measures. Go ahead. Next one, this is sort of the big issue on where we've located the bulk of the parking reductions for multifamily residential. Rather than making that a tier 1 strategy, we felt that this could really benefit from a more comprehensive review and study. There's a lot of different ways to target parking issues for multifamily. So whether that's setting parking that ties to the unit size, you know, a studio versus a 3-bedroom probably has a different demand, or whether it's based on density, whether it's based on proximity to transit or affordability, or, you know, target populations such as senior housing. So we propose this as a tier 2 strategy to make sure we can really cover all those different options and identify the most promising. But we would, you know, as part of our work together, be interested to hear any of your priorities so that we can incorporate that and help set the direction for the study going forward. Go ahead. And then, as we talked about, you know, the priority in tier 1 is expanding permission for affordable residential projects in commercial zones. But as a tier 2 strategy, we want to look at how we could add more flexibility to use the commercial and mixed use zones for greater residential development. And so a couple different strategies that could be part of that future look is thinking about ways to reduce how much ground floor commercial is required, allowing some different active ground floor uses in place of, you know, a true commercial use, and possibly horizontal mixed use instead of vertical mixed use. So some different ways to add flexibility. Go ahead. And then, you know, if you will, the flip side of this, another option that we discussed but felt was a better tier 2 priority, given our focus on residential and expanding both the units and the variety with this project. In tier 2, we incorporated what we've heard about expanding access to neighborhood scale retail and service uses within these residential neighborhoods, just to increase the amenities available for residents. And so a couple different strategies where we could get more small scale commercial uses into residential areas for further review. Go ahead. And then also for Highway 99 sub area, we'd heard some concerns about how the cross circulation requirements are applied. And we felt this was a good tier 2 strategy because there are some additional study needed just to really understand the impacts, as well as our engineering staff, the county's engineering staff indicated that they want to take a more comprehensive look at cross circulation generally. So we thought that those priorities aligned a little better than trying to work that through as part of tier 1. Go ahead. And then we also have heard some about existing manufactured home parks, but we felt that additional study was needed to understand the extent of the issue in the county, what the pressures are here, and what the strategies could be. So we see that as a tier 2 strategy. And then here's the second piece of the RVs and tiny homes that I mentioned, that there could be additional potential to locate those on some individual residential lots. And or even expanding RV parks into some high density residential zones. But we felt like this is more of an emerging issue among planners and cities. And so reviewing some emerging models about how to see how this is working would be an important part before moving forward with this as part of tier 2. Go ahead. I'll hand this to you. Thank you.
Okay. Again, reducing development review times and permitting requirements. One of the strategies I mentioned in tier 1 really focused on trying to more on coordination. This strategy focuses a little bit more on the engineering standards themselves and reviewing those and determining if there are efficiencies to be had. The second strategy on the screen is revising impact fees so that they are less for smaller units. The county would propose considering this as part of a comprehensive study of impact fee rates and potential reductions or waivers for affordable housing or different types of housing. The county is required to, to account for that a potential reduction in funds in one way or another. So a comprehensive look at impact fees is what would be proposed. And that would carry through to this D 4.1, looking at implementing an 80% impact fee reduction for affordable housing, which is authorized by state law. Again, the county would want to take a comprehensive look at impact fees and potential waivers and how they would account for those, that revenue. The next strategy is exploring the potential of a county tax increment financing tool to support affordable housing goals. This was one of the strategies that was really highly supported by our team at Echo Northwest. And certainly a study would be needed to determine where and how that TIF tool might be used. So there's that one. Exploring density bonuses for affordable housing. This was the example I gave at the beginning in terms of tier 2 strategies. I think you've heard Elizabeth and I talk a lot about the need for studies and further research to understand some of these. In this case, it's how do we calibrate density bonuses for affordable housing that are going to work within our study area and the market conditions of our study area. C1.2, county staff suggested reviewing the county's master permit program to see if either improvements could be made to the program or if a different approach might be warranted to master permitting. And C3.4, developing a marketing communication plan regarding changes to code or other strategies regarding housing options. We talked a lot about this kind of hand in hand with that, making sure the county has a single point of contact for questions about affordable housing incentives and other programs. So communicating and marketing those opportunities is important as well, we heard. C 3.5 ties into some of the strategies that Elizabeth talked about a little bit, and really monitoring housing development over time, the number and type of units, the size of units, parking provided, sale or rent levels, just a lot of different information, how different lands at different zoning designations are being developed. Are we seeing a lot of single family homes in our higher density zones? Things like that. So really tracking that information over time. Again, related to some earlier strategies, creating a mobile and manufactured home resource page on the county webpage to provide links to state programs for park preservation and relocation assistance for people who are finding challenges in those parks. G 1.1 is monitoring and supporting state and partner efforts to monitor regulated affordable housing properties that are nearing their expiration dates. So really the county just playing a support role and a coordination role with other organizations that are monitoring these properties. A somewhat related strategy, the next one, adopting a notice of intent to sell or a sale ordinance that requires owners of multifamily buildings to provide official notification to both tenants and local housing officials when they're going to sell. That would help with those tracking efforts. There were a lot of strategies where Vancouver Housing Authority was mentioned within these programs and partnerships. So at this point, we just have a strategy to identify ways in which the county can support VHA achieve its mission. I should mention in the document we sent out, there were a number of strategies or a handful of strategies where the county is already doing these things, and we debated, do we have a strategy in our document that says continue doing that? I think where we landed for now is that when we produce the final report, we're going to have a section of the plan that says here are the things that the county is doing that the county should continue doing, kind of separate from our official recommendations. So just a note I forgot to mention earlier. E 3.1, inventorying available public lands annually. This is, taking a look at the county's buildable land inventory and seeing if there's land to donate or lease for affordable housing development. F 2.1.2, work with aging and disabilities advocates to develop a universal design program to try to encourage more housing options for community members who need those additional design elements. Okay, that's the end of tier 2. In retrospect, tier 3 probably could have just been wrapped up into tier 2 since there's only 2 strategies for us to talk about. One is supporting the initiative for electronic plan review, which I believe the county is already working on to make that process quicker and easier. And then G 4.1, research short-term rental impacts in Clark County, and if needed, develop a policy around short-term rentals. So we don't know if that is an issue right now, but in the case that it is, strategies could be developed. Okay, time for discussion. I'll just remind everyone, this is our first run at these priority strategies. We will take comments that we hear today, bring them out to the public, review them with County Council and Planning Commission, and then you'll get a second bite of the apple in January. So while we'll try to make sure that any comments or recommendations that we hear from you today, we'll try to incorporate those after the meeting, but we don't necessarily have to agree 100% on everything today. We can, if there are any disagreements, we can always put it out to the public to see what they say and then revisit them at our next meeting in January. Just a reminder for non-PAG members to please, until the public comment period, turn off your cameras and stay on mute. And I will begin this conversation with the specific strategies that we identified that we wanted to talk about. So please forgive me while I scroll back up in my presentation.
I can
go ahead,
tell you what
Elizabeth.
they are. Yeah, I had the same problem. So I can give you a quick refresher. A 1.1.2 is the compact subdivision option we're proposing with the smaller lots for single family detached. A 5.1, that's the strategy about adding middle housing uses in the low and medium residential zones, adding and expanding. A 7.1 is about residential uses and commercial, where we're looking for your feedback about, is it right to prioritize affordable housing right now, and keep any other changes in tier 2. And then B 1.6.1, that's the question about multifamily parking, and if prioritizing the state minimum requirements in tier 1 is right, and then having a more comprehensive look later. And within that comprehensive look, if you want to give us any guidance of which of those priorities, should really inform the study or be priorities, then that would be important.
I do think, Elizabeth, it might be worthwhile to go back because you kind of put out some specific questions
Oh,
on those
sure.
slides, so
Just, yeah.
I appreciate that. So everyone can just close their eye. Well, you know what I'll do? I'll stop sharing. I will get to the slide I need to get to, and then we'll come back to it. So the first one was A 1.1.2, is that right?
Yep, the compact subdivision.
All right. Okay. Elizabeth, do you want to just prompt again the questions that we have? Or do you think you kind of handled that?
Let's just start with, does this make sense to develop this new path? Or do you want, is this of interest? Does this capture the direction and the concerns and the interests that we have heard from the group, distinct from cottage housing and the PUD? And refine the details as, any comments on that, welcome also.
Ron.
Yeah, thanks. I'm trying to clarify when we talk about setting minimum lot sizes at 50 to 70% of the size of the lot in the underlying zone. We're actually talking about being able to get a minimum size at 50% of what that particular zoning is.
Right.
So in the case of a 5,000 square foot lot, it would go down to as low as 2,500 square feet. Is that what we are saying?
Yes, that is what we're saying.
Okay, and the distinction between this and the discussion about, I think it was townhouses going down to 2,000 square feet as a proposal.
Right.
Is this kind of a blend of that same thought process, but targeting particular housing stock?
So this strategy is specifically targeting single family detached dwellings, right? We heard this interest that if we could just keep making the lot sizes smaller, but we still basically want to lay it out like a subdivision with streets facing onto streets, with homes, fronting onto streets, but keeping them detached. So, I hadn't thought of this exactly, but I appreciate the parallel that you're drawing to townhouses. Hopefully this is, pretty consistent with the theme of maybe a townhouse is on a 2,000 square foot lot, but 2,500 square feet or 3,000 square feet sounds better and more appropriate for a small single family detached. So hopefully they're somewhat consistent, but intended to be distinct options.
Okay. I would like the group to think about the idea of perhaps all of these particular zonings that we're showing here have the opportunity just to go with smaller lot sizes in them if they can show the proportionality of it and not basically turning them into edge by edge townhouses in essence. I think, how can I put this? I think we need to be somewhat bold in our description of what we want to accomplish, because no matter what we do, this is going to get chipped away at, and we're going to be drugged back into the middle. So I'd like us to have at least what we really consider a bold edge to the thought process for increasing density, and at the same time having affordable home ownership, and see how we can bring the community in to having that as part of the discussion.
Thanks.
Any other comments on this particular strategy? Jackie?
Steve, we got an email from Phil. He has been he's trying to unmute and cannot. And he's on the phone. I don't know which number he is, but he would like to address the group.
All right, we've got 2 phone numbers, so I'll ask each to unmute, but know that I'm trying to get
He told me it's the 5031.
I think I got it.
Cool.
Phil, are you able? Oh, sorry. Are you able to unmute? I asked to unmute, but he's on the phone. Does anyone know what the phone command is?
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. So I did, just before addressing the first tier 1 strategy, I guess I just wanted to say, you guys have put a lot of work into this. You've been at it for several weeks. We spent most of the last hour listening to the explanation. I feel like there's a lot of new information here. And I feel like, one short discussion and then no meeting until January doesn't really do justice to the effort we put in to date. So I guess I don't know. I mean, were you thinking this was it, or are you going to leave? So I just feel like there's not adequate time really to fully discuss all these.
Thanks for that comment, Phil. And we know that, yeah, there's not going to be, there is not adequate time to discuss, and we're not going to go through them one by one. There's 4 that Elizabeth called out that we want to go through, and then we're going to open it up to the group for strategies that people want to discuss further. We can talk about options, but our thinking coming into this meeting was that we spent 3 months talking about all of these in some form or another. We've certainly added some additional details onto these, but we're hopefully everyone's familiar enough to know if there's particular issues that they want to dive into deeper or talk about today. And then, we'll go out to the public, we'll gather public comment and come back to this group again in January. So that's another, 2 months to take a look at these strategies and really think more deeply about any changes that we want to make. And we can then discuss those again at the January meeting. And that's not excluding any conversation or discussion that we want to have, comments that you can submit to Jackie at any time. So that was our thinking.
Okay. Yeah, I just think, I mean, there is a significant amount of brand new detail that, just came out with this proposal. So anyway, on strategy, and I'm not looking at the presentation, I'm looking at the memorandum.
Sure.
First tier 1 strategy A-1.1.1. I'm supportive of that, but I don't think you accomplish the goal unless you also look at lot coverage, increases to lot coverage. So without a corresponding increase in lot coverage, I don't think the strategy A-1.1.1 does you much good.
All right. Thank you. Anything?
Yeah, we can definitely take another look at that, Phil. And I think I appreciate that reminder to look a little more holistically. I think the reason that we just hadn't frankly thought through that far just had to do with the way that the strategies were previously organized, and we were focusing on just lot size reductions, but you're right, it's going to work better to look at all the pieces that go into it.
Okay. Any other comments on A 1.1.2? I think we were just about to move on. So the next one on Elizabeth's list was A 5.1.1, which is right here. Take it away, Elizabeth.
Okay, so here's where we're looking at, really some signature legislation for Clark County. Could be if this strategy aligns with the PEG's priorities. We've talked a lot about middle housing, looking at ways to expand it. So looking at duplexes and townhouses, bringing those into the low density zones more comprehensively, and then introducing these triplex and quadplex uses. So next slide, I think, has some of the questions where we, there are some lot sizes that we threw out for discussion for triplexes, quadplexes, and townhouses in the attached memorandum. So if you have feedback on that, we certainly can take that now, can discuss, but we also don't need to get too focused on it. Curious to get your feedback about the design standards, if the kinds of standards that we briefly looked at here are in line with the types of things you'd like to see, or if there are any other pieces of this middle housing legislation, including the parking ratios, that you think are just really vital to making this a comprehensive, successful, and effective middle housing approach.
Any specific thoughts or comments on this item? And again, if people, like Phil said, if people need more time to review and think about these, we can, take comments anytime over the next few months. Councilor Olson.
I see, thanks. Yeah, I actually really like this one. I think it should continue to be a priority. I think, we do have to pay attention, obviously, to the lot sizes, but I think adding flexibility for triplexes, quadplexes, and townhouses is a really, really good idea. We just really don't have that represented in our urban area in the county. So I think, I actually think it's also something that the county or that the council would likely get behind if it's done right. So, I like this. I like this particular approach.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Anyone else particular thoughts on this topic? If not, I see some thumbs up. Great. I'll move on to A 7.1. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Sure. So looking for your feedback about this approach to target affordable residential uses in commercial zones right now, and looking at additional, are there any market rate residential uses in commercial zones that you'd like to see move forward with tier 1? And if so, tell us about them. What would make it worth it to you to prioritize a certain project?
Victor, go ahead, please.
Oh, well, I'd be curious to see what other folks would add, but I would lean towards no. I would just have it strictly for affordable housing, but I'm biased, so.
And if I recall from previous conversations, isn't this something that is being done in the city of Vancouver? Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, the city of Vancouver does this in commercial zones. So it's just a incentive for affordable housing development over market rate development.
Great. Councilor Olson, did you re-raise your, yeah, go ahead.
I did, yeah, thank you. So something to consider here with regard to county and county council discussions on this topic. It's been our policy, but our position that we want to save commercial land for commercial development and not put housing and residential development on it. So I think that needs to be taken into consideration. We really value commercial land and its ability to provide jobs, and we've historically in this county not done a really good job of protecting those large parcels. So that's something I think we should just pay attention to as we have this particular conversation.
Certainly like to hear, appreciate that. Would like to hear other comments. I wonder if there are, if we think that the strategy as it's written won't quite get there in terms of approval, if there are other criteria that we could think about that would make it more palatable. Sarah, you have your hand raised.
Right. So just to add a little more color to the conversation, the city did actually change their commercial code to allow for affordable housing without the requirement for commercial. And it was very specifically a change to the commercial code as opposed to just rezoning parcels for multifamily if you're going to do affordable housing. And without getting into the specifics of why it was done that way, which was critical, but just more generally, if this is allowed for market rate housing, it somewhat defeats the purpose. So in the city, generally, I mean, there's so much competition for multifamily zone land that if you're doing affordable housing, you just can't compete just on a land cost basis. And well-zoned commercial land, so commercial land that is sited appropriately in the age of Amazon, still carries land costs that aren't really appropriate for affordable housing. So generally, the market itself dictates that an affordable housing developer is looking at sort of tier 2, second-rate commercially zoned land that probably should have been residential in the first place. A way to think about this might be the lot that is 1 or 2 lots off of the main thoroughfare and doesn't exactly have high retail demand. And so I'm just throwing that out there slightly with opinion, but mostly to give it some context. So, and also to just back up what Victor was saying, that if you allow it for just market rate housing, we've lost, from a price competitiveness point of view, an ability to go after that, because then it just becomes multifamily zoned housing, which is in super, super high demand.
Thank you. Let's go Martha and then Brian.
Yeah, I think Sarah indicated this too, but my understanding was this would be commercial land that really nobody wanted to develop commercially, and maybe that needs to be put in this item so that's clear to the counselors.
Thank you. Brian?
Just want to back up what I heard in terms of support of the policy. We, in terms of limiting the potential land where this could go, the city requires it near essentially busy transit. So something like that could be looked at. There's other ways of doing it. I think one of the good things about limiting it to affordable housing is there's a limited number of players in the market, realistically speaking. And so it's not going to open the floodgates like if it was for market rate housing probably would. We adopted a policy like this, I want to say 2-3 years ago, and have only seen a couple of applications. And that's essentially what we've expected. So in support of the policy.
Thank you, Brian. And Councillor Olson and Sarah have your hands raised. I'm not sure if those are just still up. So.
Sorry.
No, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Although I will add, I appreciate the discussion because I think those details will make the next conversation better.
So I think just to summarize, what I'm hearing is from our commenters is that there's support for limiting this to affordable housing, but maybe there is some work to be done to further clarify if this should be designed for all commercial land or if we're targeting specific types of commercial land. That might not be the most eloquent way to say it, and maybe the market determines that, or maybe there's things that, I don't know if there's criteria that we put on this policy or if it's just market driven. Yolanda.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
This is a really exciting topic that we're talking about. And like the gentleman said earlier, I'm not sure if we can cover all our bases here, but maybe someone can help clarify. So when a land is deemed or zoned as quote unquote commercial versus affordable residential, is there any way possible, or has it been in the past, where that particular land was deemed appropriate for mostly affordable housing, but then with a little bit of commercial land use? I'm curious, and the reason why I bring this to all of our attention is because could it be possibly that some of that commercial land could help in job creation for the people living around it?
Thanks, Yolanda. That's a great question. And I think part of the reason that this comes up is that I think I'll try to paraphrase what Victor has said in the past, that housing developers do housing well, but maybe don't do commercial as well. So if you're talking about a larger site where maybe you have mixed use that's not attached, that could be possible. But I think in general we're talking about not requiring that ground floor retail if you were to build a residential building on a lot that's zoned commercial. I don't know if anyone else has more to add there.
I would just add, a lot of our funding sources don't allow commercial use, so we'd have to find an alternative source to build out the commercial space. So it's like you said, it's really hard for us, to find a commercial tenant or to get commercial financing to do that. And tax credits don't play well with other funding sources in general. So that's really reasons we like to keep it separate and apart.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Yeah, but I would just add, Yolanda, that, and for the group, but thinking about, there could really be some benefits to siting affordable housing projects in these commercial zones, because of then the surrounding commercial properties, if they had employment opportunities, and oftentimes these are places with access to transit, rather than seeing a commercial zone as inappropriate for housing, maybe there really are some amenity benefits that could come along with that.
That's awesome. Thank you. That kind of answers my question.
Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks. Great discussion on this topic. Let's move forward to the next one, which is B 1.6.1. Here we go. Elizabeth.
Yeah, so looking for some feedback about parking requirements for multifamily apartments. I think we proposed a somewhat limited strategy in Tier 1 to focus on just some requirements for both market rate and regulated affordable housing. And the key is, does it have access to transit as defined in this particular site, in this particular bill? The way that these definitions apply in the county essentially means that this will be along Highway 99. And I think, Jackie, if there's one other line that you want to remind me of, but I believe is how you've mapped it already. So that would see some reductions for 1-bedroom and studio apartments along those areas. So question in Tier 1 to propose now, does the group want to see any further reductions for affordable housing? Right now, the mandate treats regulated affordable as well as market rate residential identically, but we could differentiate. And are there, does this seem like enough of a bite at the apple that is viable, given this large scope of code updates, as well as, perhaps the county council's appetite to address this issue? Are there any additional reductions you'd like to see in Tier 1, or do you think the Tier 2 broader study strategy is a good way to split this issue?
Any thoughts on parking reduction? Councillor Olson.
So just a couple thoughts. I doubt the council will approve anything that's more restrictive than what the state law or RCW requires. And generally and personally, I think parking is a really touchy subject. I think I just read recently in the paper where someone was killed over a parking spot. So this can get really, really volatile, and I've seen it happen over decades. And so I just really want to be careful when we start talking about parking and reducing parking and taking away parking spaces. Well, it makes sense when we have this conversation about affordable housing and where we're going to put units. It has a real impact on livability, and it's very emotional. So I wouldn't get too aggressive on this, just my personal opinion. Certainly the group can weigh in, but just some thoughts for conversation.
Thank you, Councillor. Commissioner Barca.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with Councillor Olson in this. I think for this particular county going forward, the House Bill 2343 is probably a leap as far as we would have gotten under any circumstance anyway. I am much more interested on how we want to handle the duplex, tri, and quadplex situation, or in the idea that we get into smaller lot size developments and start looking at what do we believe is livable under those circumstances. I think we're going to have to kind of take this in bites that are based on the style of dwellings that we're dealing with. And in multifamily, I think the House bill kind of already gives us a map that we should just accept at the moment and tackle the other ones that don't have such clear guidance.
Thanks.
All right.
And I guess I would also say, if you have a follow-up comment about what you'd like to, any about those other housing types, I think this is the list of our specific strategies that we've called out. So go ahead and tell us what you think about the middle housing parking ratios too.
Mark's got his hand raised. Mark, go ahead.
Thanks.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce Ron's comment and some of the commentary on the few of these that we've discussed. We are missing out so much rich opportunity to qualify this stuff. I think B161 is a great example of how, if we were to sit down with a team of folks that have some real energy around this, and in an hour or 2 hours time come up with a very excellent element to bring forward. But I'm right along the lines of Phil. This is very problematic to have all of this energy generated, and the staff has done tremendous work here, but we're losing the opportunity for the advisory group to weigh in and start to flush these out in a much more deeper sense. So I'll just leave it at that right now, but thank you for all the hard work that's been done.
Mark, before you go back on mute, we're open to suggestions on how we might proceed. Does that mean subgroups meeting? Does that mean more PAG meetings? Like, in your mind, what's the right approach to hammering out some of these issues?
Well, if you're talking about a 10-week window between now and January, I'm looking at some sort of a more informal gathering based on particular groupings, and maybe we structure something like we're going to focus in this week on talking about these strategies, and those folks that might be available, there'd be a time set where we would host a call that would dive deep on that, and then that would need to be facilitated. But again, I think to bring a tighter group of folks together with some energy, looking in much more detail about what is actually being proposed here. Does that get to the problem? And I think hand in hand with that is that some strategies can start being generated by some of the groups that are represented in the policy advisory group. Because to just leave this as a presentation to the council from the PAG group and from the staff loses all kinds of richness and opportunity. And so for us to have that opportunity to process some of these things on a week-by-week basis over that period of time, for those that have energy and interest in particular elements, and then throw those out to the public on the website saying, this group came together and processed some of these elements. Now, there's going to have to be something done to structure that in a way that the outcomes of those meetings are packaged in a way that they can be woven into this. So it's going to take a little time in thinking about it, but I just think there's opportunity to do some deep diving with this stuff, because there's such a richness of backgrounds and experiences to be brought into it.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate that. And if there are particular areas of interest, let's raise those today. And I know there are probably challenges to meeting multiple times, but we can take the ideas that surfaced today, and we'll go back and I'll talk with Jackie and Jenna and other county staff, and we'll see if there's an alternative approach we can take. But for today, so I appreciate that, Mark. For today,
I'd call it a complementary approach, but sure, thank you.
Sure, fair enough. But for today, let's identify if there are those issues that people are interested in discussing further. I think Phil identified with the first strategy, and maybe there's people interested in talking about parking, maybe not. Let's at least identify those issues, and then we can talk about ways we can further refine the strategies that have been proposed. Victor.
Yeah, I don't think I'm necessarily opposed to this. I think our issues that we run into is on the weekend, the C-Tran bus service drops off below what's allowed for this. And so we're working on a project in the county, and we don't qualify for this because of that. We meet the Monday through Friday service, but we don't meet the Saturday, Sunday service. So I think there should be some flexibility. And we did a parking study to support that we could get a reduction in parking. This is in a different municipality, but I just think there needs to be some flexibility or understanding regarding this, and some, I don't know, either at the staff level, or we can go to the counselors to get a waiver.
Okay, thanks. Elizabeth, do you have any follow-up questions on that?
No, I think that, yeah, I'm just thinking through how we might address that, short of just waving our magic transit access wand and expanding C-Tran service.
Yeah. Okay, Commissioner Barca, you've got your hand raised. I'm not sure if it's about this or because we're just about ready to open it up to other strategies that people want to discuss. So either way, Commissioner Barca.
All right, so briefly, yeah, I like Mark's thought process about focus groups. So far, we've talked about parking, we've talked about small lot subdivision, and the zoning changes. I think we're starting to get ourselves kind of coalesced about the idea of really needing to see some breakthroughs in some very specific and targeted items that we can bring back. I like that thought, and I'm available for it. Concerning B11, B12, I think those items, they could be basically smashed together and blend some of that together. I think for the process of being able to come up with a product that enhances the development opportunity and at the same time gets us the requirements of where we think we need to be. Tandem parking is brilliant in that regard, and the idea of allowances for some on-street parking, I think could have some fence posts put around it so people understand what that means and where it's appropriate. And then to Victor's point, I was going to bring up the idea that we can't count on C-Tran budgets necessarily to say how much asphalt we put down. All right, that's it.
All right, thank you. Councilor Olson gave a thumbs up and a green check.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to do down here. Once it's up there, I don't know how to get it off. So I'm with you, Mark. I'm with you, Ron.
It's fine. I'm sure it will just go away at some point. Great. Again, we want to open it up. If there are any specific strategies that people want to talk about, just to remind everyone, were there any strategies that people want to move up and down in terms of tiers? Anything, details that should be altered? Any strategies that should be restored or anything missing? So open it up to the group and we'll start with Stefan.
Okay, we had talked a little bit, although I've raised the issue a few times of, excuse me, kind of the reverse of what's been talked about before in terms of affordable housing in commercial zones, and that is the location of small commercial areas in residentially zoned areas. I think that's B2.3. And I don't really think that's gotten enough attention. I think that for a couple of reasons, it really should be moved up in the priority discussion. One of them is that we do have, I think, a mandate to become less vehicle dependent and to put small areas in residentially zoned, small commercial developments in residentially zoned areas allows residents, especially older residents, to walk to a local store and be less dependent on buses. The other thing is, I think it goes partway towards achieving Councillor Olson's objective of not losing employment opportunities in these areas. I think that's a major point I wanted to make.
Thank you very much. I did see at least one thumbs up. Just does anyone? I think this is in the tier 2 strategies. I was scrolling kind of fast, so
That's right.
we can move that up to tier 1 unless anyone objects to that. So let us know if anyone disagrees. Brian, I think you're next. Thank you.
Yeah, a
Scott.
couple of, do you want comments just on this policy on B23 or just the larger set of priorities?
Larger set of priorities is fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. One, and maybe, I'm sure the project team has thought about this, but it sounds like the difference between tiers 1, 2, and 3 isn't just emphasis, it's also time, when these would, the length of time involved. And so just consider maybe having a labeling that reflects that. Otherwise, going forward, most people, public and so forth going forward, will understand it as emphasis. Tier 1 is more important than tier 2. So just a thought on how these are labeled.
Thank you.
I guess the other question, the other concern I had is on some of the policies or strategies rather removed from consideration. And we've got a pretty big list that are being considered, and this is going for more active public participation and so forth. And so there's a couple on the list here that I think really deserve a place in this kind of conversation. One is creation of a small lot zone, A15. That's a more, I think, that's a fairly transparent way of introducing the concept of density. If you have a zone, it has to be mapped somewhere. It has to be approved through a rezone, goes through the process. I'm worried that some of the other stuff we're leaning on are good ideas, but may be perceived by the public as kind of a workaround, as allowing 8,000 square foot lots in a zone whose label implies it only allows 10,000 square foot lots, that kind of thing. So that's one of the reasons I like A-15. I think just as a consideration, again, that we're still early in or we're going public, I think A-61 offering density bonuses and height bonuses in some cases based on the residents served, I think can really get at a more targeted approach. It begs some questions, but it would be interesting to see what kind of a reaction we get with that out there. I think it should be part of a comprehensive strategy. Lastly, and again, I'm not that familiar with the county private road standards, but I guess the B62, the call to revisit those standards and consider if one side of the street is enough. I would hope that could be on the list too. Another couple of priorities to include that aren't here, that weren't necessarily removed, are this is a bit unusual, but is it worth considering? I don't know that it even take a code change. It's a matter of when an application is submitted, particularly for multifamily development, where we don't have good sets of data like we do on single family development for pricing and costs and so forth. Simply to ask applicants what is the projected price points that the multifamily is intended to come in as, and the reality may change, but at least then you have a sense of what that is. That helps gather data. I think there was one of the policies here, or strategies rather, that talk about monitoring. I think that should really emphasize, in addition to things it already talks about, it should emphasize multifamily housing, because that getting a handle on rents, as I think as most folks here probably know, is a lot harder than on single family, and so that's an important thing to monitor. And that's all I've got for right now. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. Elizabeth, did you have any thoughts on any of the strategies that Brian mentioned?
Well, I think that you bring up a really important, I don't want to call it a dichotomy, but just sort of the the different approaches of getting to some of this smaller scale development. We did propose to move that smaller zone, the R 1.25, into the strategies to delete, and instead move forward with, reducing the minimum lot sizes in the existing zones and offering these options for middle housing that reduce the amount of lot area per unit, as well as the small lot subdivision option, or the compact subdivision is our trendy new term. We'll see if it sticks. And those just seem like the strategies that got more positive feedback and just seem more, if anything, politically viable. I didn't hear a lot of appetite in this project for any rezoning, and I don't disagree with you that it's more transparent and to rezone, but it sounded like rezoning wasn't, there wasn't that same appetite. So certainly, worth coming back to the group and just highlighting that those alternative pathways to get at essentially the same thing. And certainly, perhaps there is a tier 2, AKA the medium term, or a tier 3, AKA the long-term strategy, where it is worth developing that R 1.25 zone as an additional tool. But
great.
Yeah, so I just think whether we think of it as a lack of transparency or a greater flexibility within existing zones, I think that we did carefully consider that. And what we heard from the group was use the zones you've got and add flexibility.
Sir, go right ahead.
Real quick, if I may, to build on what Elizabeth is saying. And I do usually like to agree with Brian, but I agree with the transparency part of it. But I think we run the risk, if you make a zone like that, you're also running the risk that we're starting to look at exclusionary zoning. Whereas if we can just spread it across existing zones, I think that's ultimately both more fair and probably long-term more healthy, rather than having separate zones for what will end up likely being lower income housing.
All right, keeping with the theme of this being opened up to other strategies that people might want to discuss to move up or down in tiers, things we're missing. I know we went through a lot today, and I appreciate the notes from Phil and Mark about the challenges with going through so much material with the large group, but now we've got time, we've got 15 minutes. So let's hear more thoughts on any of these strategies, right? Commissioner, I can't tell if Stefan and Brian, if your hands are still up from before, so I'm gonna move to Commissioner Barca. Or Stefan, did you have something? No, okay, Commissioner Barca, go right ahead.
All right, so I think regardless of how bold we are or how in line we are with conventional thinking, the one thing that we really have to make sure is we have our definitions really well thought out on what is affordable, playing up, I think, what I was hearing somewhat from Brian before, because we have to have the ability to measure where we're at and see whether we get improvements from the changes that we propose. If we don't have an understanding of where we are for baseline, it really won't matter what we put forward, because we won't be able to validate our results afterwards. So I saw, I think, portions of it. I was trying to get through the packet again to see there's some discussion about 80% AMI, and that number, I think, has a lot of definitions depending upon who we're dealing with. If we're using HUD AMI for Clark County based in the Portland metro area, I think family of four is something like 73,000. If we use 2 people working full-time with minimum wage jobs, that puts the household at somewhere around 60,000. So I think we need to kind of really define what it is that we're really trying to get at with that, and be black and white about the idea of what we consider cost burdened for sheltering. If it's 30% of your gross income, 30% of your net income. I think we should just like try and put that stuff in words that we can measure for the future. And that way we can really tell whether what we're talking about parking spaces and zoning changes, whether it's really getting us where we want to be. I mean, we started off saying that, we were over 80% single family dwelling in our zoning. And I don't think it's really going to be better unless we make it where we can see that it's going to get better based on the choices we're making. So that isn't a direct correlation about what needs to be prioritized forward, but I think the words were in there, Elizabeth. I just couldn't find them specifically towards the discussion. Sorry.
Thanks. Oh, Elizabeth, you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. I was just going to say that, as far as any definitions in the zoning code itself, that will absolutely be part of the work. We didn't want to call that out as a separate strategy, but we'll take a look. And then I think what I'm also hearing, Ron, is so like Jane Jacobs' view, have been rereading, and she very much calls for like, how can we actually see that these strategies and plans and things that we're doing, what impacts those have. And so getting some of those monitoring systems and tracking set up is going to be really key, I think, to this. I think we're all curious to see what impacts some of these could have.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm certainly not the expert on this, and we have experts in the room, but in terms of our different strategies that mention affordable housing, in some cases it's defined, in other cases the term is used generally and would have to be, have further discussion if we wanted to specifically identify a specific income range. Is that correct?
Well, there's several areas where we need to make some code updates to comply with state regulations and about affordable housing, and those do have specific definitions. Oftentimes it's that 80% AMI, but other times it's 60% AMI. So we'll just make sure that it's called out in the places where it needs to be.
All right, again, the floor is open to folks who have specific strategies that they want to see highlighted, supported, ones that they want to see moved from one tier to another, or strategies that we're missing. We can also use this time to dive into one of those topics that have been identified as places that need more discussion. I realize 10 minutes isn't what we were talking about, but we have the time right now. Brian, go ahead.
Oh, just quickly, one policy that we have that it's probably too early to tell how much of a difference it's made, but it may be worth considering, is that we amended our criteria for rezones maybe 5 years ago to include among the list of considerations, not necessarily rising to the top or the only one, but among the list of considerations that the proposed rezone furthers affordable housing. So it allows those developments that, and we use the term generally, we're not trying to get stuck in a 60% or 80% AMI discussion, but those rezone proposals where the proponent can point out that the less than market rate housing is being proposed, they can point to a policy on the books in the review criteria for that rezone. So something to think about.
Great, thank you.
Yes, Brian.
Anyone else? I'm gonna sit with an awkward silence for a little bit and see if anyone's. I know some people have strategies they particularly care about, or maybe ones you want to see demoted down the list. I don't know. Commissioner Barca.
Yes, it's me again. I am a little bit concerned about our RV and tiny house description. If I look at it the way that we have RV parks today versus mobile home parks, they have one thing in common, is that they have to rent a piece of dirt, and it's usually on a monthly basis. And there's very little control over the cost of that. And I have a deep concern about the model, because the people and their dwellings usually come in at the lowest tier of cost, and that's the shelter over their head. But the inability to control the cost of the dirt that they're on seems to be the model that has proven, at least in Clark County, on multiple occasions, to be people's undoing. So I like the concept. I'm concerned about us calling it an affordable housing strategy if we don't have a way that we're able to target the people in a cost structure of some sort. So from a tier 1 standpoint, I think it makes sense, but I do have my concern in that we're not controlling it in the fashion to get the outcome that we are thinking we're going to be getting with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point is well taken, Ron, that there are financial models in manufactured home parks and RV parks that maybe are not predicated on maximizing affordability for residents. And as soon as we, escape from late stage capitalism, as soon as we, overhaul just the whole role of capital in our country, maybe we can address that. I think in the meantime, I agree with you. This strategy does not get at some of the fundamental issues. So that's why we made it a tier 1, because it seemed more achievable. And I think that tier 2 gives us a little bit more flexibility to look into different ways to site individual RVs and tiny homes, maybe by having some options outside of these parks that have a certain financial model. There could be, more stability and more affordability that could be achieved through those strategies.
Right on. I like the tier 2 thought process.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. No, but thanks for calling, our attention to the fact that this and frankly, a lot of these other strategies are headed in a direction, and we can't guarantee the end costs to residents, because zoning code just doesn't really set up to do that.
Okay. Well, if there are no other pressing strategies that people would like to speak out in favor of or raise at this time, I think we'll just use our little bit of extra time for public comment. So sorry for the scrolling here. I have a slide that I need to, okay. So please, if you're interested in providing public comment, click the raise hand icon to indicate you would like to speak. We will only acknowledge those who have raised their hand by selecting the hand icon. I realize, yeah. When you are acknowledged, you will be unmuted, or you can unmute yourself, I think. Please limit your comments to no longer than 2 minutes. And when you've finished your comment, please click on the lower hand icon to indicate that you're done with your comment. And with that, I'm going to call on Glenn. Thanks for being with us again, Glenn.
Oh, don't know why my camera's not working, but I guess it doesn't really matter. Yeah, it's a pleasure to have been here. It's been a pleasure to listen to this conversation. And, I've already provided some input, and I appreciated hearing some discussion of some of the things that I mentioned, especially on the affordability issue and what it's called, what it stands for. I think that's critical. Last thing we need to do is introduce a multifamily tax exemption program into the system just to create market rate housing. I don't think that that's the goal that we have in mind with that. On a second note, I don't know if it's ever been discussed again, because I've missed several of the meetings, unfortunately, but one of the things that I would love to hear discussed, because I don't know if it's a great idea or if it's a terrible idea, but kind of getting away from like, a lot of this is going to end up as kind of like infill, a lot that has one house that somebody ends up splitting apart. And I'd like to see some flexibility in the lot sizes and the parking requirements to be more of an average as opposed to a bare minimum. I think that would create some extra flexibility in terms of, one, being able to keep the existing house and not having it be in the way and get demolished. Then you might have a house, small house on a 1,500 square foot lot, 2,000, whatever it may be, with no parking space. And then you have next door, a bigger house on a bigger lot with several parking spaces to make up the difference and bring that average back into play. I think that would be something to consider at least and discuss if there is an option. It sounds like it might be a little bit too late at this time. One thing I did want to mention also is that I noticed that impact fee waivers were being considered. I would just caution that if we do go the route of waiving impact fees, that those accounts be backfilled, because if they're not backfilled, then we don't end up with the funding that we need for parks or whatever the impact fee is supposed to be funding. So I'd add caution to that. And also about the discussion of affordable housing and reducing the parking requirements. One thing I think is important to consider is that especially in our county area, in our unincorporated areas, I think cars are a huge ticket out of poverty. And so, if we're putting people that are struggling into areas that they don't have the ability to have a car, which would be their ticket out of it, we're kind of preventing their ability to better their lives. So again, we want to keep it as affordable as possible. And so it's definitely a discussion that needs to take place in terms of how much parking, because it is so expensive, but we need to be careful not to limit it to the point where people can't have that ticket to a better life. So I appreciate you listening. Thanks for all that you guys do.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Next, we'll call on Justin Wood.
Hi, Steve. Thanks. Justin Wood, Government Affairs Coordinator for the Building Industry Association of Clark County. Just had a few comments today. It seems like zoning and density have been a huge part of the conversation here. And just wanting to understand the purpose of zoning and its relationship to density. The industry is fully on board with creating denser housing, specifically the compact subdivision idea, really in support of that. And then also on kind of the metric for affordability, it is outlined in House Bill 1923, kind of what governs this whole process. So kind of a guiding tool there, as well as for the comprehensive plan update, where we get kind of that affordability metric there as well. I hope you all got my comments from the letter, and just a couple strategies that could be done in the short term. Modifying the PUD ordinance, really lessening those open space requirements as a reference to the cottage housing strategy that was presented today. Increasing that lot coverage, because we can decrease minimum lot sizes, but without increasing the minimum lot coverage. We want to have those two in conjunction with each other. And then backfill, to Glenn's comment on the impact fee. 80% seems pretty high. And maybe we have a stipulation having that impact fee reduction for affordable housing instead of just smaller units. Maybe that 80% for affordable housing, and then maybe a 40%, 30% reduction for a smaller unit. So just wanted to input there. And I appreciate the chance to comment, and look forward to hearing what you guys come up with.
Thank you very much, Justin. Appreciate that. I'm not seeing any other hands raised at this time. So if there's no other public comment, then we'll move forward into next steps. So again, we're still kind of towards the tail end of this phase 3, developing recommendations, before we move into preparing the action plan and going through the legislative process. So we know that over the next few months, we'll have a public meeting open to the public to discuss these items, as well as an online questionnaire. We also will be doing some, if everyone can make sure they're on mute, please, that would be great. We're going to be doing some targeted outreach to some different interest groups that we're talking about right now, potentially underserved communities and some others with specific interest in these items. Another meeting with Planning Commission and County Council, dates to be determined. And then, as I mentioned, the meeting number 9 will be on January 25th. I'll send out that calendar invite. Also, per comments from Mark and Phil and others, after this meeting, we'll talk with county staff and see if there is a way where we can have some additional conversations between now and January 25th about some specific topics. Jackie, do you have anything to add?
No, I think you covered it. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for your time and attention. Again, if you didn't have a chance to go through the packets before this meeting, please do take the time to do so and send us any additional comments that you might have about any of these specific strategies. You can find all the materials on the web link I sent out, and then the PowerPoint gets posted there as well. If you have any questions about the nuances of any of these, please reach out to Jackie and she'll pull Elizabeth or me into the conversation as needed. But yeah, we just want to make sure that we're getting all of your thoughts and comments out on the table so we can put forth the best packet of recommendations as we can. And with that, I'll just say thanks again for your continued participation and the time and energy that you put into this. We really do appreciate it. And yeah, and I'm hopeful we'll have a really good product at the end of this process because of all of your efforts. So thank you very much. Have a good evening.